Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening. Depends where you're calling in from. I see there's some familiar names. Some folks are on the East Coast. Some folks are on the West Coast of the US. I'm not sure if we have folks calling in from other places around the globe, but welcome to everyone. If you feel comfortable, it'd be nice to see your faces. I'm just looking at names in these black boxes. Again, you don't have to, but it's nice to be able to see your face, see your reaction. Because sometimes if you can't see your reactions, you don't know if people are interested. They could be really bored. So I have to change something, go in a different direction. People are smiling and reacting, then kind of get a sense that it's getting through. So feel free to open your video if you're comfortable with that. Excuse me. So today's topic is the Dharma of Grieving. For today's talk, I will primarily just utilize the teachings of the Buddha to talk about grieving. Maybe I'll introduce a little bit of some either Western psychology or counseling sort of techniques or concepts of modern counseling to address grieving. But for the most part, I'll make use of the Buddha Dharma, the basic concepts of the Buddha's teachings. I'll also try to use some concepts and methods of Chan practice or meditation practice, mindfulness from the tradition of Chan, Zen Buddhism. But I think it's safe to say that within the Buddhist tradition, there are really so many universal teachings, whether it's this tradition, that tradition. If it talks about wisdom and compassion and leads us to that, it's basically all the same flavor. It's all the Buddha Dharma or the teachings or methods that help us find wakeful living. So the title is the Dharma of Grieving. And within Buddhism, what does Buddhism have to say about grieving? Is there like a specific Dharma or a specific teaching that focuses on grieving, or some sort of extensive instruction or manual? I'm not aware of something like that. So I'll just draw from bits and pieces of what the Buddha taught to address grieving. So what is grieving? First of all, we should define what this topic is. So grieving, we could describe it as sadness, but a prolonged sadness that lasts longer than just a few moments, a day. It's not just a mood, but it's a prolonged sadness that can last even months, maybe years. And it's due to a sense of loss or an idea of loss. So something in our lives that we feel we have lost, it just brings about sadness. And that's normal. It's a normal process for human beings to experience this painful emotion when there is this concept of losing something. I think it's referred to as grieving when this sadness just takes time, and it's a process, and it doesn't just easily go away, doesn't just easily disappear. We call that grieving. And grieving usually fades or passes when we come to acceptance of something that we've lost. Just for example, maybe it's a person in our in our lives a person who has passed away. So in the beginning, we may feel great sadness, and this may last a while, months or years, and it usually fades. Um, it may fade because we just accept it, accept the reality of the loss, or maybe we have a shift in attitude. Maybe we see the situation differently, not so much as a loss. And I'd like to talk about that later. Sometimes, however, grieving is prolonged, and the process of grieving is no longer healthy, and it continues, and it doesn't fade. And sometimes it may either increase in severity or um, maintain this sort of painful state. And that can be a problem. Grieving that doesn't fade, grieving that doesn't become fully processed can lead to illness, can lead to mental illness, and can lead to physical illness as well. And maybe you even know of people in your life or stories where grieving has killed them. The sadness was so powerful that they were unable to bear it, and their own life was lost, whether it was intentional that they took their own life, or it could have been that the sadness just depleted them, and eventually they passed away as well. So grief or the sadness can be processed well in a healthy manner, and it can be processed in or not processed and lead to an unhealthy situation. And I'll address both of those kinds of possibilities. I'd like to talk more about loss as a concept. What is loss? It may mean something different to each one of us, but loss in general, I think we can say, is that the belief that we had something and now it's gone. Before, something existed and now it doesn't. So in our mind, that thing or that person, in our mind, it feels like it's there. And when we think about them, when we think about it, we know that that person is there, or that thing is there, or that situation is there in our life. With loss, that idea is then shaken, or the image in our mind now changes, and we may imagine a kind of a void, a nothingness. As if the person is gone, we may imagine there's nothing left. Or if the thing or situation is gone, again, we may imagine there's a nothing. So this is a concept. There's something that's here. When it's gone, it's lost. So again, one example is human life. We have our friends, we have our family members, we have people who are not so connected closely to us. We know when they're here, and when they pass away, we feel they're lost. We know they're gone. Loss could be a relationship, could be a friendship, could be an intimate relationship, could be a lifetime of partnership. And sometimes relationships end when people pass away, but sometimes relationships end, as we all know, because they just don't work out. So relationship, a loss of relationship is a kind of loss, the ending of a relationship. Material possessions. We may have things or objects that are very dear to us, and when they're destroyed or when they're missing or stolen, then that we can experience a sense of loss there as well. I don't know if you've ever had anything stolen from you, but that may bring about a very painful feeling. The thing itself being lost, and on top of that, maybe there's anger that someone else took it, that someone else has it. Of course, this can relate back again to relationships where we may be in a close relationship with someone and it may end because of someone else's involvement. So, in addition to loss, there may be anger or jealousy and all these other kinds of negative emotions and thought patterns on top, mixed in. So, loss, a sense of loss, may not only be the only emotion, the only idea or thought pattern happening. It's often mixed in with many more, a complicated mix of thoughts and emotions. In addition to material possessions, maybe we lose a certain capacity. For example, we lose our memory. Maybe our memory starts to fail, either with age or with injury. Maybe we lose a skill. Again, maybe this is due to aging and due to the decline of our body. And maybe we lose a certain skill because of an injury, a sudden injury, and we may lose the ability to do something that we've loved. So for example, someone who plays an instrument, usually instruments are played with the hands. The fingers are very important. If their hand is injured or damaged, that may affect their playing of the instrument so much that they may not be able to play what they once were able to play. And that can be a very painful kind of situation. Not only that, but if we lose capacity, which disables us from being able to participate in our job or in our role in our family, that loss of physical capacity or mental capacity can be extremely painful, because then not only the loss of that ability is painful, but we may also start to see ourselves in a different way. We may start to view ourselves as now lacking. We may see ourselves as less of a person or incapable of contributing to the family, to society. So a person's self-image and self-value may decrease with this sense of loss of capacity. In addition, status. Maybe it's a status where our image to the public is damaged. I'm sure we've seen the recent public cases of celebrity figures and these their defamation, and how this kind of losing face or losing reputation is a very painful thing. And because of losing that, maybe a lot of conflicts develop, not wanting to lose reputation, fighting for one's reputation, and even in some cases, trying to harm others to maintain one's own reputation. So when there's a fear of loss, there may also be this trying to cling to reputation, so much so that it even drives us to do harmful things and creates anger and resentment and this kind of vengeful attitude. We kind of see this play out in public figures' lives, and maybe we've experienced it in our own life. A loss of status can bring about a whole other collection of problems and just internal and external conflict. Loss could also be, just for a final example, loss could be where we feel we've lost time. Maybe we feel we've lost a period of our life. I've heard people say that, 10 years of their lives were lost, ruined because of something. So that loss of time and that loss of opportunity may also be very painful. um, and can last even for years and years, where a person may regret after feeling this loss of opportunity, loss of time. Maybe they feel it's their own fault, so they feel regret. And that may hang uh, or stay within the person's mind for years. So all these are just examples of loss. Maybe you can relate to some of them. But it's basically having and then not having. And then all the other um, thought patterns and emotions that are stirred based on this loss. It can be very, very complicated. So how do we usually deal with loss? When we face loss, what's our reaction? And I'd like to first just demonstrate or talk about what are some of our unskillful reactions. What are the unskillful ways that we have, or unskillful things that we do trying to deal with loss? So for some people, for some of us, maybe we're just not willing to face it. Maybe it's so painful. The loss is so painful that we just can't face it. And for yourself, you can think of any one of those examples I just gave: a person passing away, a relationship ending, our reputation being destroyed, losing a capacity. When that happens, it may be immediately very painful. And the only thing in our mind is that which we've lost. We're just thinking about how much we want it and how it's just gone. Our thoughts may be revolving again and again on this loss. And the situation which brought about the loss, we may also be thinking about that almost constantly, or maybe not constantly, but obsessively. And in Buddhism, we use the term attachment to describe this obsessive thinking, or a thinking which perpetuates and perpetuates this negative emotional pain. So when we find ourselves in that situation, some people may choose distraction. One of the quickest ways to deal with loss is to distract ourselves. Not in a healthy way, but maybe we just try to find something to take our mind off of thinking about, obsessing over the loss. Right? Have you ever had a friend kind of say something to you when you had lost, to say, "Yeah, just find something to take your mind off it. Let's go, I don't know, let's go have a drink. Let's go do this or that. Take your mind off of it." Sometimes the only way to take our mind off of it is to find something else to occupy our mind. And one of the first things that's at our disposal could be this, our phones and devices. Maybe we distract ourselves with information, stimulation from our devices, from all kinds of media. Those can be very distracting and fill our minds with something else, because it's images, it's imagery, it's sound, and the stimulation from our devices can almost bring us to another place altogether. We may totally forget about the loss temporarily because we're enjoying the stimulation of media, or of just distracting images and sounds. This distraction can lead to a kind of numbing. Um, some people that I work with, some clients describe their own coping, their own unskillful way of coping as numbing, which means that they do something to the point where they stop feeling, or they're feeling their senses are dulled, and their whole experience is dullness. So for example, after being stimulated by media, or alcohol or other kinds of drugs, can very quickly numb our senses and make us not feel, or feel less, or have a dulled sensation or a dulled experience of the world. So engaging in these things to a certain point, we lose clarity and we just feel dull. I don't know, have you ever kind of binged on media, and after it, how do you feel? Right? You just feel like very dull. Um, Things don't register clearly. So it actually numbs pain in a way. Um, it'd be very interesting to look into the science behind it, the science behind painkillers, as well as the science behind, binging on any kind of stimulation to a point where our sensory experience is just numb. That's one way we try to avoid loss. And unfortunately, this pattern of avoiding loss can just go on and on and on. And the loss and the grief is unresolved. It just may not feel so painful because the person may be numbing themselves every day. That's what addiction often comes from. Drug addiction, addiction to stimulation of any kind. Um, Addiction is usually uh, trying to cope with pain. In this case, it could be loss. And a person can do that day by day, year by year, and the grief is never resolved. That's one unskillful thing that we may do. It's not willing to face the loss. Another thing that we may do is that we just resist the loss. We acknowledge it, we know it's there, but we just reject it, we resist it. Because with the idea of loss and dwelling on the idea of loss, there's emotional pain, right? And that emotional pain it's not pleasant. And so we may have a reaction to reject it, to resist it, to be angry with it. And oftentimes we may direct that resistance to other people and blame others. Have you experienced that, or seen someone who blames other people for their pain? Um, if it was a loss of a period of time in their life, maybe they blame their family or blame a friend. You did this to me. And so there's this narrative around the sense of loss. So the narrative becomes a blaming narrative or a blaming story where it's someone else's fault. And if that's the case, how can the grief be resolved? Because now we're constantly blaming somebody else for it. Can that other person now resolve it? If it was their fault, then can they resolve it? Will it make us happy? Will it take away our sense of loss if they do something? When we blame people, we may not think about that. Or maybe we do. We hope that they apologize or hope that they do something that will take away the pain. But that doesn't really resolve the grief. It doesn't really resolve the sense of loss. It may make a person feel a bit better, but it doesn't resolve the grief. So this habit of blaming can also go on for years and years and years and almost devour a person from the inside out. This kind of ongoing anger and blaming can continue until someone's death. And that's a very painful way to live. And it's almost uh, enslaving themselves, trapping themselves in blaming and not taking responsibility or not trying to deal with the pain themselves. So that leads to the next unskillful thing that we may do, which is we don't do anything about the loss. We don't take any steps to deal with our pain or to deal with the situation. um, we may become inactive, depressed, and we don't do anything about it. We may just allow ourselves to get stuck in these thoughts, these recycling thoughts about our loss, the memories of something we can't get back. And so although our minds are kind of recycling in these thought patterns, we're not actually doing anything to resolve it. We're not doing anything to move forwards. So maybe you should just, use some examples. If we just use an example of a time, we feel that we've lost the time of our life. We think that we've lost our youth or lost because of our parents, because of our family. We may feel they didn't take good enough care of us. They didn't love us. They didn't educate us well enough. So we've lost that time of our youth to grow and to learn, to feel loved and to feel good. um, a person could just feel terrible about that. They may numb themselves because they feel miserable. They may resist or reject the pain and blame their parents. Maybe some people, or some people I know, quite a few people have told me stories of where they really feel their parents just didn't love them. And because the parents were fighting and the marriage was very conflicted, the child grew up in this household of violence and pain. So they feel this blame towards their parents. And they may just get stuck there. They're in pain. They blame the parents, and the thoughts of how what they've lost can't be regained is filling their mind. The anger towards their parents may also fill their mind. And also, maybe because they feel terrible about themselves, terrible about this loss, they may also feel a jealousy towards other people. Seeing other people who had a good childhood, seeing other people who had loving parents, they may feel a jealousy towards other people. Why can't I have that? Why didn't I have that? It's not fair. Why is it that other people have parents that love them and I don't? Or I didn't. A person can get stuck there, not take any steps to try to move forward with their life or to try to, despite the loss, do the best with what they have. And their minds get stuck in these cycles of negative, destructive thinking. So they don't deal with it. They're not dealing with grief. And finally, another way that we may unskillfully deal with grieving is that we just may not be able to accept the reality of life, of how things change, or of how we don't have the control that we want. Um, there may be this loss. We may feel that if we could have just controlled something, then everything would be fine. Or if we just had more control, if we could just get what we wanted, then the grief would be gone. So, going back to the example of the person who feels they lost their childhood and they lost the opportunity to be loved. They may try their best to find a person in their life and to hold on to that person and to try to get love from that person. It could be a friend, it could be an intimate partner, but because they feel such a lack of love and such a great loss, they may try to grasp onto any kind of love or grasp onto another person who could potentially give them love or potentially love them, and try to control that in some way, even try to control the person, control their behavior. Even if that relationship is not healthy, a person who feels a loss of love or a lack of love may even stay in an unhealthy relationship just because there's even a small possibility of love there, and they try to hold on to that and cling to it. This is holding on to the idea that love can be obtained from the outside. So how many of us may feel like that in some way? How many of us have this idea in our mind that if we just had love from the outside, we'd be fine? And can we somehow control it or hold on to it or keep it? So far, I don't know if you're following along. Some of this is kind of abstract. I'm trying to use examples. Hopefully you can follow along here. So the one main example I used was the person who lost their childhood in a way, or who didn't receive the love they thought they should have had. There are many other examples of loss that maybe you've experienced, maybe I've experienced. Again, it could be a loss of friendship. The story that always comes to mind in the Buddha's teachings of loss is the story of the mother. I believe it was a mother who was in the Buddha's tribe or clan, and she had a baby. And this child, very soon after birth, died. Right? So it was either a stillbirth or it was very soon after the baby died. That's, that has to be an incredibly painful experience. Of course, I can never bear a child myself. For a mother to bear a child, for those of you who have had children, I'm sure you've experienced that, this kind of expectation of the child coming. If you want to have the child, this kind of positive expectation where you're waiting for the child to come and planning, all kinds of planning and imagining what would the child look like? What would the child be like? How can you raise the child? How can you bring this child, and create a life for it that's beautiful and wonderful? Even before birth, there's so much expectation and there's so much cherishing of life. This is, in a way, it's a beautiful thing. That kind of mother, I'm sure, is very loving, very caring for the child. So to have that child die at such a young age, that's got to be such a impactful, and a great deal of pain. So this mother in this story was incredibly upset, and she knew of the Buddha. She supposedly also had a kind of religious faith and belief that the Buddha had special abilities, special powers, and a belief that not only the Buddha, maybe other people had a certain magic or capacity to bring back the dead. So she believed there was some way that could bring her child back to life. And she eventually went to the Buddha and she asked, "Is there a cure?" He said, "Yes, there's a cure." And so, she was full of hope, and she said, "What is it?" So he said, bring some mustard seeds, a pinch of mustard seeds from a home where there has never been a death or a loss in the family. So she heard that, and as the story goes, she was carrying her baby with her. She was so distraught that she couldn't even bury or I think at the time they did cremation. So she wasn't willing to even bury or cremate the baby. She was still clutching it and going door to door, asking for a cure to try to bring her child back to life. And at first, she was asking, "Do you have mustard seeds?" And people were like, "Yes, we have mustard seeds. We'll bring them." So she was kind of elated. And when they brought the mustard seeds, she said, "But wait, have you had anyone die in this household, in this family before? It can't be, if so, then I can't take these seeds." And they were like, "What do you mean?" Of course, there's been death in this family. People who were here before have passed away, of course. And so she went from home to home, trying to find a home where there was no death or loss of life. So eventually she couldn't get any mustard seeds, and she returned to the Buddha. And he said, "Well, that's the reality. Human life. Death is just a reality. You have to face it. There's no other way around it." So eventually she realized that her efforts were impossible. To find a place where there was no death was impossible. To find this cure and bring her child back to life was also impossible. So she eventually let go. She let go of her grieving. Or, to be realistic, the story says that she had this awakening and insight and was, in a way, immediately relieved from grief. But it's possible that it was still a process for her. She may have let go of the idea of trying to bring her child back to life, which is a great relief and an insight of in a way. But maybe it still took her some time to grieve and to accept that her young baby has passed away. So, that's just one story, which illustrates that from the Buddha's teachings, the way to deal with grief. It's a very, vivid story on how to deal with grief. So now I'd like to talk, about how to skillfully deal with loss, using this principle and understanding that the Buddha talked about of impermanence, of change. And what I said before about the 4 unskillful ways of dealing with grieving, I'll just use the flip side and present 4 skillful ways of dealing with loss, which actually Master Sheng Yen, the founder of Dharma Mountain, we often call him Shifu. So Master Sheng Yen had this, he also had a formula for dealing with all kinds of problems. And the formula was 4 steps. The Chinese is called 4 Ta. So the 4 the four things that can resolve our pain and suffering. So the first is to face it, to 面对, to face whatever the loss is. Let me just list them first. So the first is to face it. The second is to 接受它, to accept it. The third is to 处理它, to deal with it. The fourth is to 放下它, to drop it. So face it, accept it, deal with it, and drop it, or let it go. So if we look at dealing with loss, and I'd like to again use the story of the person who felt their childhood was lost in a sense. So in facing it, facing that loss, sometimes family life is just unavoidably difficult. Some households are seemingly more fortunate than others. In some households, there's just a lot of pain. The parents may have married or started to raise children at a time in their lives where they were still suffering quite a lot. They each didn't know how to deal with their own suffering very well. So in their relationship, just had so much conflict. Sometimes it's just unavoidable, especially if we're the child. What can we do? Can't just fix the parents, can't just fix the situation. Sometimes it's unavoidable. So to just have that understanding that things are unavoidable and different conditions that come together, we can't necessarily control that. This idea of causes and conditions in Buddhism, the idea that many things come together to bring about, for example, a family. Some of the conditions that brought about that family may be that there is a lot of pain within the family, within the generations before and the current generation. There's a lot of unresolved pain. That's many different conditions that we can't control. So to face that is the first step, which can help relieve us of trying to avoid it. We just face it. There's a certain degree of ease when we face and we stop trying to control things that we can't control. And the second, to accept it. To accept the situation and not to blame other people. What does blaming do? Blaming just makes us miserable, and it prevents us from trying to take responsibility, paralyzes us. So instead of blaming, and let's go, in this example, instead of blaming our parents, can we try to understand our parents? Can we try to understand with a compassionate attitude that the reason why they couldn't love us, or they didn't know how to show love to us in the way that we want, it's because they were suffering. Now, sometimes a child who didn't feel love from their parents may think that their parents were trying to hurt them. They may even think it was intentional, that the parents were intentionally trying to hurt them. I would say in most cases, that's not the case. Unless a person is very mentally disturbed, they're probably not going to try to intentionally harm their child, but they may not be able to love their child or care for their child or comfort their child when they suffer so much themselves. So coming from the child's perspective, now grown up, that person can reflect. My parents were really suffering a lot, and they didn't know what to do with their suffering. That's why they were unable to show love to me. This is compassionate compassionate understanding. We may not necessarily know what the parents were suffering with, but there must have been something which prevented them from showing love, being more loving. So that's part of accepting the loss, so to speak. So the third step, to 处理它, or to manage or to do something about it. One way to do something about it is actually to shift our mindset, to see the situation a bit differently. Maybe the situation can actually be seen as a gain, or if not a gain, at least some kind of learning. We can learn something from our pain. We could learn something from our sense of loss. So maybe the person felt that their parents, didn't love them, but because of all the pain that they went through, they learned many lessons. And this lesson in itself is learning how to understand others, learning how to understand how suffering kind of block our capacity to show love or to show care. We can shift our mindset and look at, what do we learn from this loss? We can even, and this may sound strange at first, but for the people who we felt harmed us, maybe we can even generate a kind of gratitude towards them. Even though it feels like they hurt us, they're actually teaching us a lesson. It may sound very strange, but the pain that they brought us, or the things that they did that we felt were hurtful, that was a lesson. It's a very challenging lesson, but a lesson nonetheless. So we can actually generate gratitude towards them. And even if we feel this gratitude, we may be even motivated to do something for them, to express our gratitude. The person who, to their parents, they could express their gratitude somehow. Despite all those pain that had happened, all those painful situations that happened throughout those early years in their life, if they're able to really embrace it, feel grateful for it, maybe they can now support their parents. And if the parents still have issues, maybe they can find ways for the parents to resolve them. Maybe the child can find ways for the parents to work through their difficulties. That's actively doing something to transform this kind of grief and pain in the family into and to resolve it, and in a way maybe eventually end the transmission of pain from generation to generation in the family, and have a transmission of more harmony. Because in this generation, the parents' relationship is resolving the conflict, and the child and the parents, they're also working on their relationship. And again, they're all adults now. I think for a young child to be able to do this, maybe they can, but it takes a great deal of maturity and insight. So let's just say that it may only be adulthood for a person to truly be able to face it, accept it, manage or deal with grief based on this kind of family situation. But maybe not. Maybe there's some very special, insightful, very young people who can do the same. And what about letting go? What about dropping it? What about really being able to drop the idea of loss altogether? Because there's a question here. Is it really a loss? It's an idea of loss. My childhood is lost. That's an idea. Is it really ultimately a loss? This is where Buddhism challenges our concepts of things. The Buddha challenged our ideas of gain and loss. The gain and loss were considered one of the 8 winds, the Ba Feng, the 8 winds, or the eight kinds of things that really affect us and cause us a lot of affliction in our life. Gain and loss. It's a kind of pair. If we look at the deeper teachings of Buddhism, the ideas of gain and loss are seen as actually ignorance. What does that mean? So gain and loss, how is it ignorance? The Buddha pointed out that actually gain, what is gain? Do we actually ever gain something and actually are able to keep it? Anything that we gain, can we really keep it forever? Whether it's a material thing, whether it's a relationship, whether it's our health, as I'm coughing, can we ever keep good health? Even if we work out every day and take supplements and whatever, can we keep our health? Can we keep a relationship the same? Can we keep even love in terms of more emotional affection? Can we somehow keep our partner and maintain their affection? So they're always affectionate, always loving, it's always there. The idea of gain actually goes against the reality of impermanence, change, and goes against the reality of conditioned being, or conditions, that anything that we gain comes about because of many different conditions. If those conditions are not there, that thing or that experience is gone, passes. So even something like love or affection, it's based on so many different conditions. Again, based on this family situation, based on generations of conflict or generations of complicated family life. So if it does turn out that we do have a good family situation, things seem to be great, or a good relationship, will it always be that way? So Buddhism points out that gain and loss are not ultimate, permanent gains, but whatever we gain is a temporary, conditioned thing. And that when conditions are ripe, that thing is gone. So loss, when say we lose something, is it lost forever? Is there just nothing? Are we now doomed? The Buddha challenged that as well. If we lose something, if we lose a relationship, or if we lose love from someone, if you've experienced that, maybe someone who you felt was very loving at some point doesn't love you anymore, or we don't feel that love. It may feel like it's just gone forever. And we're sort of doomed in a way. Buddha also challenged the idea of loss in that when something is gone, it doesn't mean there's nothing left. Just because one person doesn't show us affection doesn't mean there's no affection for us at all from anyone. Or just because someone, for the time being, doesn't show us affection doesn't mean that later on they won't be affectionate. Right? For those parents, just because the parents didn't show love at a certain period of time in that child's life doesn't mean they're forever unloving or uncaring or unable to show or express their love to the child, right? So the loss of childhood doesn't mean that now in adulthood, that person can't experience love from their parents if they really work on the relationship. There's still the potential for a kind of deeper love and connection. So loss is not a permanent loss either. So there's a teaching in Buddhism that says there's no gain and no loss, similar to the teaching of no birth and no death, no coming and no going. It just means that whatever is comes about because of many different things. It doesn't come from nothing. Whatever is changing. We can't keep it. But whatever is, when it passes, doesn't mean there's nothing left either. So even if a relationship, again, with our parents, for example, even if it's just as hard as we try, it's not possible to develop that deeper connection, to find that deeper love and affection between the parents and children. It doesn't mean that a person can't find that love from somewhere else, from friends, from other family members, maybe from someone they don't even know yet, but a person who becomes their friend, a person who becomes very supportive, very caring. And at the same time, they may also be able to develop love from within themselves and not depend so much on love from others. This may be one of their biggest lessons. That by letting go of the idea of loss, a person can find this richness within themselves. They haven't lost love. There's a potential to connect with many different people. And there's a potential to connect with this, we could say, a kind of reservoir of love and compassion within themselves. By letting go of depending so much on love from the outside, trying to control it, to get it, to hold on to it, and to keep it. So by actually letting go of the idea of loss, and it's also letting go of the idea of gain. We can really dwell more in the present moment. We could dwell in the present moment, the present experience, and find this love or find this compassion, kind of, we could say, a more purer love. Find a compassion within ourselves, which is fulfilling. So the kind of deepest teaching of Buddhism is letting go of the idea of loss, letting go of the idea of gain. Eventually, we still have the memories. We still have the memories of our experiences. We still have our life lessons, and it becomes part of our wisdom. We can say that all the pain that we've experienced that went along with our idea of loss, all of that pain, all of that conflict, we don't just forget it. We know what it was like. We remember what happened, but because we've been eventually able to let go of the loss and feel fulfilled internally, all of these experiences become tools for us to communicate with others, and tools for us to share how to deal with loss, how to be liberated from gain and loss. Excuse me. And so to to conclude now with the practice. What I spoke of is more just concept and theory. So based on the 4 steps of handling problems, 4 steps of dealing with loss in this situation, facing it, accepting it, dealing with it, letting it go. How do we actually do that? So one practice, which we often do in the Chan and Zen tradition, is sitting meditation. Most of you know that. How do we deal with loss in the context of sitting meditation? Well, we actually accept it. We fully experience the pain of loss, including the concept, our ideas of loss, because realistically, our mind will be filled with, how I've lost something, how I can never get it back, and how this is so painful. First, we sit with that. As meditators, we don't try to just block all this. Some people approach meditation as just blocking all this stuff out and trying to just clear their mind and have no thoughts and no feelings. That's destructive and that's dangerous. A person can get sick if they try to block pain through meditation. What we're actually doing in meditation is fully experiencing the pain of loss. Recently on a retreat, when I presented this approach, one participant had a question and she said, well, will it actually go away if we do that? It doesn't sound like that will work. Like if we just sit with this pain, won't it get worse? If we just let it be there, won't it get worse? Won't it stay there? That shows how strong our sense of permanence is. It seems like the pain is permanent unless we have to actively do something to like clear it out. So there are some meditations and in some traditions where like you actively imagine that you're clearing your pain, like you're visualizing somehow this pain and darkness and bad stuff within us, kind of getting rid of it, cleaning it. And maybe that has a certain function, but from another perspective, that's actually avoiding pain. That's actually resisting and rejecting pain. It's not necessarily transforming it. So with this approach of Buddhist meditation, we're just fully experiencing the pain as it arises, as it changes, whether that pain is a more physical pain, a heaviness of the body. It could be an emotional feeling, which is also in the body, these sort of painful, unpleasant sensations in the chest, in the stomach, maybe in all different places of the body. Pain can sort of reside or habitually appear in certain places of the body. Some people may even feel pain in their neck. Some people may even just feel all kinds of discomfort with grief. A part of this is also, again, the painful ideas, the memories, the unpleasant ones, the pleasant ones, and even the narrative, the blaming narrative. That may also be really strong when we begin to sit with our grief. And it's okay for that to arise because it's already been arising. It's already there. It's already cycling. With meditation, we face it. We embrace it. We don't necessarily need to actively do anything. We could use a method like a method of compassionate contemplation, where we actively reflect on the suffering of others and we actively wish them well. It's a more active approach to sitting meditation. But we can use a more passive and just simple approach, like the method of silent illumination, or just, we can call it a general mindfulness, the general experience of our body and mind as it changes. So we can just sit with simple awareness of our body and how it feels. We could sit with simple awareness of the feelings that come and that go. We could sit with simple awareness of the thoughts that arise, the story that goes along with the pain, and the emotion that arises and, uh, and passes. What we're doing is we're training ourselves just to see, just to experience the change and the conditioned nature of grief. We're just directly experiencing how grief comes about because of these conditions and how it can also pass. We can see how that grief comes about because of the main condition of holding on to the idea that we've really lost something. If we can let go of holding on to the idea of loss, that we've lost something, that's the main condition which can then release and allow the grief to pass. So if we cling, that's the condition for our grief continuing. If we just experience the pain, experience what grief is without clinging to the idea of a loss, our grief will be there for a bit, but it will pass. We'll so-called process the grief. We'll process the grief just by being simply aware of it as these conditions that arise and pass. If clinging is there, that emotional pain and grief will be there. If clinging is let go of, clinging to the idea of loss, then that emotional pain and grief will pass. The story of loss will no longer be necessary. So, an image to describe this kind of practice is like we're learning to be like the sky. We're learning to be like the sky, which has clouds. Some clouds are white, some clouds are dark, clouds coming and going. We're learning to be like the sky, which is just there, embracing whatever clouds are there. When the clouds pass, the clouds pass. The sky doesn't grab onto the clouds and kind of squeeze onto them and try to keep them there. And the sky is unaffected by them. You can't think about the analogy too scientifically. It's just an image. But the sky is not affected by clouds. So we can learn to be unaffected by the initial experience of grief and pain. And if we see it clearly, the clouds of our emotions and our thoughts will clear. They happen, they arise, but when the condition for attaching to loss is not there, these clouds of thought and emotion pass and they clear. And we find release from grief. So in this way, we're transforming grief. We're transforming kind of pain and dis-ease to clarity, to ease, to kind of clarity and stability of mind. It's transforming grief into wisdom, into compassion. So I'll finish here for the talk. How to look at grief theoretically, how to understand it, and then how to experience grief and transform grief experientially. This is the Buddhist path of practice, concepts and the methods to deal with, for today's topic, how to deal with grief, the so-called Dharma of grieving.